Since the start of the year, South Africa's agricultural conditions have been roughly mixed. I think if one looks at the broad economic figures, you would think that we have had a fairly positive year. But I think when you dive deeper into various subsectors of agriculture, the picture is mixed. The folks that are in the grains and the oilseeds industry, they've struggled with the midsummer drought. But if you talk to folks that are in the horticulture, that is vegetables and fruit, they've had a reasonably better start to the year. And of course, I would say to those that are in the poultry and in the livestock industry, this has been a period of a recovery. And of course, when you take then the step back and say, how has the South African agricultural sector from an economic indicators perspective looking like, you realize that we've registered a solid start on the economic performance, at least in the first quarter of this year. And that has been in part because of that good output in the fruit and vegetable side, recovery in the poultry and the livestock industry, and of course the base effects. Because at the end of last year, we have seen a contraction. That is what has delivered that good performance for the first quarter of 2024, if you were to look at the gross value figures of South Africa's agriculture. And that solid picture of the performance is what you also see when you consider how much we exported to the world as a country. We've made the point repeatedly that if you look at South Africa's first quarter exports for the 2024, they are up 6% on a year-on-year basis. And of course, in terms of the trade balance, that is up roughly 20%. And if you dive deeper and say what was on that basket of the exports of South Africa, you realize that fruit, wine, wool, beef, and indeed even maize from the previous season were some of the products that were at the top of that particular basket. And this is what has delivered this performance that we see. But if you take a step back from all of those economic figures and say, but how is the sentiment in the sector and how are the people in the agricultural sector feeling about the business conditions at this moment? I think you will appreciate that folks are still fairly downbeat. And this is really something that we have seen since the start of the year. The mood in South Africa's agriculture has been downbeat throughout various subsectors of it. But what's more striking about the figures that we are releasing at this moment for the second quarter of 2024 is that South Africa's agribusiness confidence has dropped to its lowest level since 2009. And you may ask and say, what is so different this time around in the second quarter compared to the first quarter? And I think there's a number of things there that the respondents to this survey have told us. One of the effects that they have mentioned is that they are still lingering concern about some of the factors that they've been complaining about for some time. Municipalities, for example, they're still underperforming. There are still lingering animal disease challenges. We continue to see that there's not a lot of improvements that is being made on the roads infrastructure, but also globally, the environment, the tension, the rising geopolitics, and the impact of that on trade. And thinking about trade in the context of the point that I just made, that as South Africa, we participate aggressively in export markets with what we produce. So we do want to see an environment that can continue to absorb the products that we export. But some of the distinct things, of course, is this story of the drought that I've been repeating, that you have these underlying factors, but you also have a drought that affected the grains and the oilseeds industry more adversely compared to other subsectors of agriculture. What's also unique about this particular moment is the fact that we were in an election period and we did the survey right after the election outcomes before the formation of the government of national unity. And in that particular period then, there was heightened uncertainty about what will the political direction of South Africa be. And now if you combine then the political uncertainty, the effects of drought, and these underlying factors that I've mentioned, I think that everyone will understand why the agribusinesses, the farmers, and many other folks that are in the industry that we survey in this sentiment felt that perhaps at the period of the survey, they were quite uncomfortable about the business conditions in the country. And this is indeed a sentiment, not the actual economic indicator. And what we're trying to portray here is that the economic figures have somewhat been painting a positive figure than what we continue to see when we're measuring the sentiment in the sector. There is that disconnect. But appreciating the fact that the sentiment index is a lead indicator for investment. If it remained depressed for quite some time, we begin to worry about the fixed investment in the sector and indeed the long-term growth of the sector. This is a composite index, and it comprises about 10 sub-indices that are underneath it. Figures like unemployment issues that we measure, we look at the agricultural conditions, we look at the turnovers of businesses, as well as the capital investments that are in the sector. That's the menu of some of the sub-indices that underpin this particular sub-index. But that's the data that we continue to make available in Agbiz website so that one can have a flavor of what really we are measuring when we talk about this composite index, the Agbiz IDC Agribusiness Confidence Index. But I do think that this story of the exports is important, and maintaining the infrastructure and ensuring that we continue the good work that Transnet, organized business, on organized agriculture are already doing. That needs to continue even in the new administration because it is fundamental to what we are doing as South Africa's agriculture. Already, we are exporting about half of what we produce. And I think that if we aim in the long term to increase the volume of production, we need to ensure that the logistics in South Africa are performing effectively. It's a one thing to emphasize the underperformance at Transnet and at the ports that we have seen, and also to celebrate the improvements that they are making. But I think we should do that, not forgetting that the municipalities also need to fix the rural roads, because before everything else goes to the ports, it has to be transported on the roads. And I think there's still a room for improvement there, and the new administration needs to pay attention on that. Some of the other aspects that are important to us is the fact that as the new administration come in this environment where the sentiment is depressed, they begin to address the fundamental aspects that can change the mood of the agribusinesses. What can change the mood in the sector, outside of the factors that we don't control, is the implementation of the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan. And I think that all stakeholders agree that we need a relentless focus on the implementation of this. We don't need the introduction of new other plans. Continuously releasing with title deeds the land that the government owns is one of the other important aspects. Addressing the animal diseases, working with the private sector in that effort is something that needs to continue. And of course, Department of Agriculture making with the Department of Trade and Industry on widening the export access to various countries that we are in. We've made the point about logistics, but we also need to diversify the markets that we're exporting to beyond the African continent, beyond what we enjoy in the EU, but making sure that we have broader access in China, in India, in Saudi Arabia. Those are some of the important markets that as South Africa we have to focus on. But I think outside of those agricultural focus points, we have to tap in on what the Operation Vulindlela folks are saying. They are talking about the improvements in the network industries, which is particularly the roads, the railway line, the water infrastructure, as well as policies. That is the menu of all of the aspects that need to be addressed. And lastly, I do think that the issue of rural crime is also important. Stock theft and all other sorts of crimes that make life difficult for some of fellow South Africans that are thriving and doing business in rural South Africa is something that the Department of Agriculture, working with other ministries, must resolve. And I think if we do this, then we stand a chance of changing the sentiment, making sure that there's a long-term investments in the sector, and of course, be able to attain growth and job creation and continue to be a country that is food secure and seeing vibrancy in rural economic side of South Africa.